December 7, 1941, Japan's torpedoes were so advanced they could sink a battleship from 5 miles away, while America's were so defective that submarine commanders called them the enemy's best defense. For 2 years, Japanese convoys sailed past broken American submarines with confidence, their naval officers literally laughing at intelligence reports about U.S. torpedo improvements. But by 1944, Japan's entire merchant fleet was at the bottom of the Pacific. So what did the Americans figure out that transformed the war's biggest failure into history's most lethal weapon? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 7, 1941. The sun rose over Pearl Harbor like any other Sunday morning, but within 2 hours, the world changed forever. Japanese torpedo bombers screamed across the Hawaiian sky, their sleek Type 91 torpedoes slicing through the shallow harbor waters with deadly precision. These weren't ordinary weapons. They were masterpieces of engineering, modified specifically for shallow water attacks, fitted with wooden fins that let them run in depths where everyone said torpedoes couldn't work. Battleship Row erupted in flames. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that sailors on ships a mile away were knocked off their feet. The Oklahoma rolled over like a dying whale. The California settled into the mud. The West Virginia took 7 torpedoes and somehow stayed afloat. In Tokyo, military officers celebrated with sake and songs of victory. They had struck the American Pacific Fleet a blow so devastating that surely the weak Americans would sue for peace within months. The political atmosphere in Japan was electric with triumph. Emperor Hirohito's military advisors gathered in ornate rooms with sliding paper doors, reviewing maps that showed Japanese territory stretching across the Pacific like a rising red tide. They had conquered Manchuria, dominated Korea, and now controlled most of China's industrial centers. Their alliance with Germany made them part of a new world order. America, they believed, was a nation of factory workers and businessmen, not warriors. The Japanese soldier was trained from childhood to value death before dishonor. The American soldier, they thought, valued comfort before courage. This belief ran deep in Japanese military culture, taught in every academy, repeated in every officers' club from Yokohama to Manila. The technological situation seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the most advanced torpedo in the world, the Type 93, called the Long Lance by Americans who would later face it in battle. This weapon could travel 20 miles at 48 knots, powered by pure oxygen instead of compressed air, leaving almost no wake to warn its targets. American torpedoes used old compressed air systems that created visible bubble trails. The Long Lance carried a warhead packed with 1,000 pounds of explosives. It could blow a destroyer in half or cripple a battleship. Japanese torpedo bombers had trained for years to deliver these weapons with samurai precision. At Pearl Harbor, they achieved an almost 80% hit rate, something American naval experts thought impossible. But beneath this triumph, something else was happening aboard American submarines scattered across the Pacific. The USS Gudgeon was on patrol near the Japanese home islands when news of Pearl Harbor arrived. Commander Joe Grenfell immediately went hunting for revenge. He found a Japanese submarine on the surface, fired 3 torpedoes from perfect position at a target that couldn't miss, and watched in disbelief as all 3 weapons failed. One ran too deep. One exploded prematurely, 50 yards from the target. One hit the enemy submarine directly in the side and didn't detonate at all. The Japanese submarine crash-dived and escaped. Grenfell wrote in his patrol report with barely controlled rage that his torpedoes were worthless, that the enemy was being protected by American incompetence, that something was terribly fundamentally wrong. He wasn't alone. The USS Sargo fired 13 torpedoes at a Japanese aircraft carrier and got 0 hits. The USS Skipjack put 4 torpedoes into a tanker at point-blank range and all 4 were duds. The USS Seawolf watched their torpedoes pass directly underneath a destroyer without exploding. Submarine captains began returning from patrol with full loads of torpedoes, having given up even trying to use them. They wrote detailed reports describing how torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than their depth settings, how magnetic exploders detonated too early or not at all, how contact exploders failed even with perfect 90-degree hits. They included photographs, witness statements, careful measurements, mathematical calculations proving their weapons were defective. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, the organization responsible for all naval weapons, refused to believe them. Rear Admiral William Blandy and his staff had spent 15 years developing the Mark 14 torpedo. They had run it through countless tests at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. The tests showed it worked perfectly. Therefore, it worked perfectly. The problem, they insisted, was crew error. Submarine commanders didn't know how to aim. Torpedo men didn't know how to maintain their weapons. The solution was more training, not weapon modifications. When submarine captains insisted the torpedoes ran too deep, Buord replied that their depth-measuring equipment must be wrong. When they said magnetic exploders fired prematurely, Buord said they must be firing from incorrect positions. The Bureau had never actually tested a live Mark 14 by firing it at a real ship and seeing if it worked, because live fire tests were too expensive, but they were certain their calculations were correct. Meanwhile, Japanese naval intelligence was collecting American torpedoes from failed attacks. Duds that embedded themselves in ship hulls without exploding were carefully removed and shipped back to Japan for analysis. Engineers in Yokosuka examined these weapons with growing satisfaction. The American Mark 14 used old technology, simple magnetic exploders that could be defeated with degaussing equipment that removed a ship's magnetic signature. The contact exploder was crude compared to Japanese designs. The propulsion system was noisy and inefficient. Most importantly, the Americans seemed incapable of making them work properly. Reports came in from convoy after convoy, merchant captains describing how American torpedoes missed, ran past them harmlessly, or hit without exploding. Japanese destroyer captains began treating American submarines as minor nuisances rather than serious threats. Some grew so confident they didn't even bother zigzagging, the basic defensive maneuver that made torpedo targeting difficult. In officers' clubs across the Japanese naval empire, at Truk Lagoon in the Carolina Islands, at Rabaul in New Britain, at Kerr Naval Base near Hiroshima, Japanese officers shared stories and laughter about American torpedo failures. One destroyer captain described watching an American torpedo break the surface and porpoise like a dolphin before sinking. Another told of a torpedo that circled back toward the submarine that fired it, forcing the American boat to crash dive to avoid being sunk by its own weapon. These weren't isolated incidents. They were happening constantly, month after month, across thousands of miles of ocean. The Japanese Navy began planning convoy routes and ship movements with the assumption that American submarines were essentially harmless. Yes, they had to be watched for, but they weren't the threat that Japanese submarines posed to American shipping. The math seemed clear. Japanese torpedoes worked. American torpedoes didn't. Therefore, Japan would win the underwater war. But something was changing, quietly, far from the attention of Japanese intelligence officers. In Pearl Harbor, in Brisbane, Australia, in submarine west areas across the Pacific, American submariners were talking. Not to Buord, not through official channels, among themselves. Commander Dudley Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo began conducting his own tests, firing torpedoes at cliffs and coral reefs to see what actually happened. Other captains did the same. They discovered their torpedoes were indeed running 10 to 15 feet deeper than set. They started manually adjusting depth settings to compensate, lying in their official reports to Buord about what depths they were using. They discovered that magnetic exploders were triggering too early, detonating from the magnetic field of a ship's hull before the torpedo actually made contact. Some captains began secretly deactivating the magnetic exploders entirely, relying only on contact detonation. They whispered these modifications to each other like resistance fighters sharing secrets. Japanese intelligence noticed none of this. Their reports in late 1942 and early 1943 continued to describe American submarines as active but ineffective. Sinkings remained low. Convoy losses were acceptable. The situation was under control. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had famously predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, American industrial power would begin to tell. His timeline was proving accurate in terms of American ship production. New aircraft carriers were already sliding down ways in numbers that frightened Japanese planners. But underwater, the submarine threat still seemed manageable. The Mark 14 torpedo remained broken. And as long as it remained broken, Japan's supply lines from the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia to the home islands stayed open. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, all flowed north on merchant ships that sailed past American submarines with increasing confidence. The contrast was set: Japanese triumph versus American frustration, advanced weapons versus defective ones. But hidden in that frustration was something the Japanese military culture couldn't recognize, something that would prove more dangerous than any torpedo. American submariners weren't accepting failure. They were documenting it, analyzing it, and preparing to fix it, with or without permission from Washington. June 1943. The convoy protection officer aboard the Japanese transport ship Katori Maru stood on the bridge watching the empty Pacific horizon with routine boredom. His convoy of 6 merchant ships and 2 destroyer escorts was making the run from Rabaul to Truk, a journey they had completed dozens of times. American submarines were known to patrol these waters, but in 2 years of war, his personal experience matched the intelligence reports. The Americans were everywhere and nowhere, firing torpedoes that missed or malfunctioned. Just last month, a submarine had fired 4 torpedoes at his convoy, and all 4 ran deep, passing harmlessly beneath their keels. He had written in his report that American submarine commanders seemed poorly trained, unable to calculate proper depth settings. Then, at dawn on the 3rd day, 3 massive explosions ripped through the convoy in less than 2 minutes. The lead merchant ship simply vanished in a tower of flame and steam. The second ship broke in half, its bow and stern rising into the air like a closing book before sliding under. The Katori Maru itself shuddered as a torpedo punched through its engine room, flooding it instantly with seawater. The officer grabbed the railing as the deck tilted beneath him, his mind unable to process what was happening. American torpedoes didn't work like this. They didn't hit with this precision. They didn't explode with this devastating power. The USS Trigger, under Commander Roy Benson, had just demonstrated what a submarine could do when its torpedoes actually functioned. Benson had spent months testing and modifying his weapons based on the underground network of information flowing between submarine captains. He had deactivated the magnetic exploders entirely. He had adjusted his depth settings to compensate for the known running depth error. He had trained his crew to set torpedoes for contact explosion only, the simplest and most reliable detonation method. The result was 4 ships sunk in one patrol, more than most submarines had sunk in the entire previous year. His patrol report was different from earlier ones. Instead of frustrated descriptions of failures, it read like a hunting log. Target identified. Firing solution calculated. Torpedoes away. Hits confirmed. Ship sinking. Next target. Across the Pacific that summer, Japanese convoy commanders began experiencing the same inexplicable nightmare. Ships that should have reached port disappeared. Radio calls went unanswered. Scheduled arrivals never happened. In July, the USS Wahoo, under Mush Morton, found a convoy in the Yellow Sea between China and Korea. Morton had become legendary among submariners for his aggressive tactics and his complete distrust of Bureau's official guidance. He used his own depth settings, his own firing solutions, and contact exploders only. He stalked the convoy for 6 hours, positioning his submarine perfectly for each attack. When he was done, 9 ships were on the bottom. 9 ships in one engagement from a weapon system that Japanese intelligence still classified as defective and unreliable. Morton's radio message back to Pearl Harbor was simple and brutal. "Destroyers gunning for us. Depth charges are close, but we're giving them the slip. All fish expended. Another big day. Coming home." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Japanese Navy's response was confused and fragmented. Local commanders reported increased submarine effectiveness, but attributed it to luck or temporary circumstances. Central Command in Tokyo still received reports saying American torpedoes had fundamental design flaws. Nobody seemed to be connecting the dots between the increasing sinkings and the possibility that the Americans had fixed their weapons. Part of this was cultural. Japanese military doctrine emphasized perfection from the start. Weapons were developed, tested thoroughly in controlled conditions, and then deployed. The idea of fixing a weapons system during active combat operations, of submarine captains conducting unauthorized field modifications, of enlisted torpedo men rewiring exploders against official regulations, this kind of improvised chaos seemed impossible to Japanese planners. Their own weapons development followed rigid protocols. You didn't modify a torpedo because some captain in the field thought he knew better than naval engineers in Tokyo. But by August 1943, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Japanese merchant marine losses exceeded new ship construction for the first time in the war. The crossover point had arrived. More ships were sinking than could be replaced. The oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies, so critical to Japanese industry and military operations, started requiring full destroyer escorts just to have a chance of reaching Japan. Even with escorts, losses mounted. The submarine USS Harder sank a destroyer that was actively hunting it, a feat that shocked Japanese anti-submarine commanders. Destroyers were supposed to kill submarines, not the other way around. The USS Snook ambushed a convoy near Formosa and sank 4 ships before the escorts even knew where the attack was coming from. The USS Guardfish intercepted a troop transport carrying 1,500 soldiers to New Guinea and sent it to the bottom in less than 4 minutes. Japanese naval intelligence finally began serious analysis of captured American documents and interrogations of submarine prisoners. What they discovered was shocking, not because of any secret superweapon, but because of the systematic nature of American problem-solving. The prisoners openly discussed how their torpedoes had been defective. They weren't ashamed of it. They described in detail the 3 major flaws. Torpedoes running too deep, solved by manually adjusting depth settings to compensate. Magnetic exploders firing prematurely, solved by deactivating them completely. Contact exploders failing on impact, solved by redesigning the firing pin mechanism. Each problem had been identified, documented, tested, and corrected. The Americans had treated their weapon failures as engineering problems to be solved, rather than shameful secrets to be hidden. What truly alarmed Japanese analysts was the scale of American industrial response. Once Bjord finally admitted the torpedoes were flawed, something that didn't happen until mid-1943 after 2 years of submarine captain complaints, American factories didn't just fix the existing inventory. They produced new torpedoes by the thousands. Mark 14s began flowing to Pearl Harbor and Brisbane at rates Japanese intelligence officers initially thought were reporting errors. 50 torpedoes per week. Then 100 per week, then more. The Japanese torpedo factory at Kure, one of the largest in the world, produced about 2,000 torpedoes per year. American factories were approaching that number every month. And every single new torpedo incorporated all the fixes that field experience had identified. By September 1943, Japanese convoy planning had become a nightmare of changing routes, increased escorts, and acceptable loss calculations that kept rising. A convoy that once needed 1 destroyer escort now needed 3. Routes that once ran straight from point to point now zigzagged wildly, adding days to journey times and burning precious fuel. Radio silence became mandatory, which meant ships couldn't call for help when attacked. None of it mattered. The American submarines found them anyway, and now when they fired, ships sank. The Mark 14 torpedo, mocked for 2 years as America's greatest weapon failure, had become the most effective ship killer in the Pacific, and the killing had only just begun. September 1945. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Nakamura stood on the deck of an American transport ship, watching the coastline of Japan emerge from the morning mist. He had left this place 4 years earlier as a convoy escort officer, confident in Japanese naval superiority and certain that American forces would crumble before the warrior spirit of the Emperor's navy. Now he returned as a prisoner of war, though the Americans didn't treat him like one. They had given him 3 meals a day, more food than he had seen in the final 2 years of the war. They had provided medical care for the shrapnel wound in his leg. They had even let him keep his personal diary, the leather-bound notebook where he had recorded his observations throughout the war. That diary now felt like evidence from a different universe, a record of how completely wrong he and his fellow officers had been about everything. His ship had been sunk in the Philippine Sea during the massive American submarine offensive of 1944. He had spent 14 months in a POW camp in Hawaii, and what he experienced there had shattered every belief he had carried into the war. The camp was not a place of torture or starvation. It was organized with efficiency that seemed almost casual. Food arrived on schedule in trucks that never seemed to run out of fuel. The camp hospital had more medical supplies than the naval hospital in Yokosuka had possessed even before the war started. American guards were professional but not cruel. They followed rules that seemed designed to maintain human dignity even in captivity. One guard had shown him photographs of his family farm in Iowa, talking about corn harvests and tractor repairs as if the war was just an interruption to normal life, not a cosmic struggle between civilizations. What haunted Nakamura most was the abundance, the casual, thoughtless abundance that Americans displayed without even noticing it. The POW camp served meat 3 times a week. Japanese sailors at the end of the war were getting meat once a month if they were lucky. American soldiers complained about the food, called it boring or tasteless, threw away portions they didn't want. Nakamura had watched a young American private dump half a plate of potatoes into a waste bin and felt something break inside his understanding of the world. That waste represented more calories than a Japanese submarine crew member received in 2 days. And the American was throwing it away because he was full. The concept seemed obscene and impossible at the same time. The industrial capacity he witnessed was even more devastating to his worldview. From the POW camp, he could see Pearl Harbor, the same harbor Japanese forces had attacked in 1941. He had seen photographs of the attack's aftermath, burning battleships and destroyed facilities. Now, 4 years later, the harbor was more active than Tokyo Bay had been at the height of Japanese power. Ships lined the docks in numbers he couldn't count. Cranes loaded supplies onto transport vessels around the clock. Submarines, the same type that had destroyed the Japanese merchant marine, were being towed to anchorages because there were too many of them to keep in active service. Too many submarines. The concept was alien to Japanese military experience, where every vessel was precious and losses were catastrophic. Americans had built so many submarines they didn't know where to park them all. His diary entry from March 1945, written in the POW camp, captured his moment of complete ideological collapse. He had written in careful characters, trying to make sense of the senseless. We were taught that Americans were soft, that they valued comfort over sacrifice, that their industrial society had made them weak. But I have seen the truth now. Their comfort is not weakness. It is excess capacity. They feed prisoners of war better than we fed our own sailors because they produce so much food they can afford generosity. They build weapons in such numbers that they can afford waste. We confused efficiency with strength. They proved that abundance is its own form of power. A nation that can give 3 full meals to its enemies is a nation that cannot be defeated by starving itself in the name of fighting spirit, The transport ship docked at Yokohama, and Nakamura walked down the gangplank into a Japan he barely recognized. The port facilities were ruins. Cranes stood like broken skeletons against the sky. Warehouses were burned-out shells. The few ships at dock were rusted and listing, abandoned where they had been damaged because there was no fuel to move them and no materials to repair them. American occupation soldiers directed traffic with casual authority, their uniforms clean and pressed, their trucks running smoothly on gasoline that seemed limitless. Japanese civilians moved through the wreckage like ghosts, thin and exhausted, wearing clothes patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. His family home in Yokohama had survived the firebombing, but just barely. His wife and 2 children looked at him as if he were returning from the dead, which, in a sense, he was. Most convoy escort officers had not survived the war. His wife told him about the final years, the starvation rations, the constant air raids, the day they had eaten the last rice in the house and didn't know if more would ever come. His son, 12 years old now, asked him if the Americans would kill them all. Nakamura looked at his son and thought about the American guard in Hawaii who had shown him family photographs, about the casual abundance of the POW camp, about the industrial capacity that had crushed Japan not through cruelty but through overwhelming productivity. He told his son that the Americans would not kill them, that occupation would be hard but survivable, that the Americans were not the demons Japanese propaganda had portrayed. That night, alone in what remained of his study, Nakamura read through his entire war diary from beginning to end. The early entries were full of confidence and contempt for American weapons. He had written detailed observations about American torpedo failures, about submarines that missed easy targets, about weapons that were clearly inferior to Japanese designs. He had written that American submarine commanders seemed poorly trained and their weapons inadequate for modern naval warfare. Then the entries changed. Summer 1943, noting increased submarine effectiveness but attributing it to luck. Fall 1943, reporting that convoy losses were rising but assuming it was temporary. Winter 1944, describing how his own convoy had been attacked by a submarine that hit 3 ships out of 4 torpedoes fired, a success rate that seemed impossible for American weapons. Spring 1944, the final entry before his own ship was sunk, admitting that something fundamental had changed, that American submarines were no longer the minor nuisance they had been in 1942. He picked up his pen and wrote a final entry, dated September 1945, summarizing what he had learned. We dismissed their torpedo improvements until their entire fleet sank ours. But the real lesson was never about torpedoes. It was about 2 different ways of thinking about problems. Japanese military culture demanded perfection. We developed our weapons to be perfect from the start, tested them carefully, and deployed them with confidence that they would perform as designed. When they succeeded, we took it as confirmation of our superiority. When they failed, we blamed the operators, not the weapons, because admitting design flaws meant admitting our preparation had been imperfect. American culture, from what I witnessed in captivity, operates differently. They accept failure as information. Their torpedoes failed catastrophically for 2 years. Their submarine commanders documented every failure in detail. Their Bureau of Ordnance initially refused to admit the problems, but the pressure from field operators eventually forced change. They fixed the depth running issue. They deactivated the magnetic exploders. They redesigned the contact exploders. Each fix was based on real combat data, not theoretical calculations. More importantly, once they identified the problems, their industrial system could respond with speed and scale we could never match. Japanese torpedo production was centralized and limited by resource shortages. American production was distributed, abundant, and accelerating throughout the war. They could afford to waste torpedoes on testing because they had so many. They could afford to modify designs in the field because replacement weapons were always available. Their excess capacity gave them permission to experiment, to fail, to learn, and to ultimately win. Our scarcity forced us to pretend our weapons were already perfect because we couldn't afford to admit otherwise. Nakamura walked to the harbor the next morning and stood looking at the rusted hulks of Japanese warships, pushed aside to clear the channel for American vessels. The destroyer he had served on was gone, along with most of the Imperial Japanese Navy. American submarines had sunk over 1,300 Japanese ships, more than half of all Japanese naval and merchant marine losses. The Mark 14 torpedo, the weapon Japanese intelligence had dismissed as fundamentally flawed, had become the most effective ship-killing system in naval history. Not because it started perfect, but because the Americans were willing to admit it was broken and fix it. He thought about his time in the POW camp, about the abundance that had seemed so wrong, so wasteful, so contrary to the warrior values he had been taught. Now he understood. That abundance was what allowed Americans to feed prisoners generously while their own soldiers ate even better. That industrial excess was what let them build submarines faster than Japan could sink them, and torpedoes faster than submarines could fire them. The casual waste he had witnessed, the half-eaten meals thrown away, the supplies that seemed limitless, that wasn't decadence. It was margin. It was the space between survival and comfort that gave a nation the freedom to experiment, to fail, to learn, and to ultimately win. Years later, Nakamura would become a teacher, educating a new generation of Japanese students about the war. He would tell them about the torpedoes, about how Japanese confidence in their own superiority had blinded them to American adaptability. He would explain that the lesson wasn't about weapons technology or industrial capacity, though both mattered. The lesson was about intellectual humility, about the willingness to admit failure and learn from it, about understanding that rigid perfection is fragile while flexible improvement is resilient. He would tell his students that Japan lost the war the moment it became unable to admit its weapons might be flawed, because that inability to accept failure meant it could never improve. America won the war the moment its submarine commanders started documenting torpedo failures in detail, because that acceptance of failure was the first step toward fixing the problem. In the end, we were not defeated by American torpedoes, he would write in the textbook that would define his teaching career. We were defeated by an idea. The idea that acknowledged failure is the beginning of improvement, while denied failure is the guarantee of defeat. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.